You mentioned that Europe is hurting themselves with the proxy war against Russia, but now also this situation with China. China is the largest trade partner for many nations around the globe, up there, and probably the top three for most European countries. And so, if they're already suffering because of the sanctions they attempted to impose on Russia, and what is the next logical step? Where's the U.S. going to push Europe next? And if, as Angelo is saying, the leadership in Europe does not represent European best interests, so what's going to happen to Europe if they keep going down this path alongside the U.S. in this proxy war? And I just want to show how serious this is. We talked about McCall talking about boots on the ground in Taiwan. Angelo, you pointed this out right before we started. China-Taiwan conflict, 25 U.S. defense contractors to visit Taiwan to discuss joint production of drones and ammo. And this is just a verbatim repeat of what the U.S. did to Ukraine from 2014 onward. Where is this going to drag Europe, Danny?
I think it's going to drag Europe into economic crisis and political instability, what we've already kind of seen a taste of over the course of the Ukraine conflict. You already hear EU leaders talk about, for example, Josep Borrell talk about things like sanctions on China should China arm Russia. And Baerbock was kind of intimating that indeed China may support Russia in the future. And these leaked documents actually accuse, the Pentagon leaked documents actually accuse China of already doing so indirectly. But as you both are probably aware, they make these kind of suggestions that certain Chinese commodities and products that are exported to Russia help with the production of certain weapons, or China's trade with Iran then helps with the production of drones that are used by Russia, Iranian drones that are used by Russia and Ukraine. So I do think that there is going to be a huge push to economically bring Europe more and more down the path of decoupling. And I think that's what made Emmanuel Macron's trip so infuriating. And the optics were really interesting about that trip, because you were talking about some of it, Angelo, with the train ride for Ursula. But there was also a clear boundary drawn, a line of demarcation, that there would be no joint meetings between all three of them. There would be no pictures taken, right? So altogether, every conversation that was had was done separately. So Ursula met with Chinese leaders, and then Macron met with Chinese leaders, but they never came together. And I think that on the one hand, Europe was trying to be, the EU is trying to be a little strategic about how it wanted to present itself. But I also think on the Chinese side, there was a lot of caution about making it look like the European Union was ganging up on China publicly, because for one, that was really all Ursula's visit to China with Macron was about. It was about holding Macron's hand and hoping that he wouldn't say the wrong thing. It didn't work, because I don't think anyone really recognizes Ursula von der Leyen or any of the EU's top brass as legitimate diplomatic partners at this point, and legitimate representatives of any kind of legitimate entity on the world stage. And so China definitely did not want to be seen as being bullied. And even Macron decided to go off script, especially on Taiwan. But this idea of strategic autonomy now has the EU kind of split, because today, I believe the president of the European Council, Mr. Michel, came out and said, yeah, we're for strategic autonomy. Perhaps it is smart not to follow the US. So there are these breaks, but they can't be trusted, because just like Macron, he's an investment banker, worked at like the Rothschild and Schwab Bank. You know, he is a neoliberal through and through. He has, despite all of his rhetoric, right, throughout the Ukraine conflict, I know, Brian, we've talked about this. Macron has talked about, being a mediator in Ukraine and trying to take an independent position. But what has France done? I mean, some of these leaked documents show that there are French special operations forces operating in Ukraine. It's not as if they're not a party to all of the aggression that the United States has been leading the collective West along. And so it isn't to be trusted. But I think we are going to see more political instability. They're already predicting in the Pentagon, because these leaked documents show that Ukraine's political situation could very well get really bad very soon. But I think Europe, we're seeing it too, where with the protests in France, and I know Germany's had unrest. We've seen the Czech Republic. We've seen so many countries kind of rise up. People rise up and say, no, we don't want just unlimited funding and unlimited war from NATO. And I think that's what's coming. And I think the EU is definitely going to try to tighten up its economic warfare toward China to try to show that it's tough. When that will happen, how that will happen, unsure yet, because there's so many different areas it could try to target, but it will only end up going badly for Europe and its economy.
Yeah, I think so too. And well, you mentioned how France and other European nations have gone along with the US on everything: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and all of these conflicts, as we've talked about many times before. This was all part of a single agenda to encircle and contain both Russia and China. And so they have been accomplices all the way up until now. But as Saudi Arabia is on the path to demonstrating, it doesn't have to be like that forever. And I guess that's why I want to kind of focus on this. We see what's happening over Taiwan, how it's really heating up. The U.S. really wants to precipitate some sort of conflict that is going to force the Europeans to get on board with sanctions. Angelo, what do you think is going to happen if the United States and Europe decide to put Russian-style sanctions on China? How is that going to turn out? I mean, look what already happened with Russia. I mean, I can't even imagine what will happen if they try to repeat this with China.
Well, we saw how it damaged, especially European economies when it came to Russia. You have to multiply this probably by 10. There's one thing is probably China, when it comes to sanctions, they are in a much stronger position than the collective West. China now, if he doesn't trade with the collective West, is pretty much self-sufficient. What does China need from the collective West? It needs its market. But you see, European economy, the US, now with the declining position of the US dollar, it is, China needs to shift its economies, its partners. And it has started, actually. South America, Africa have become like very big partners. So it has diversified. Now, if the collective West doesn't trade with China, well, many things that China does, other countries don't do. Rare earth, for example, China has a monopoly there. And then if they find new suppliers, it's going to be much more expensive because China is still a cheap place. It's a very highly productive. It's not cheap, but because of productivity, it makes the product very cheap. So Europe has already inflation problems. You are not going to shift overnight suppliers. It doesn't work like this. Lots of products you need there's a lag time. You need and there's a huge setup cost. Set up a factory. Well, they tried semiconductors. They tried to transfer semiconductors factories to Arizona. How much did they put there? Tens of billions of dollars, and now they realize it's not going to be possible. Probably not easy, but it's going to take much more time, and maybe not even possible to get to the same level of what Taiwan is doing. So I think there's lots of words there, but not very realistic. So again, it's shooting themselves in the foot.
Yes.
I just want to add one more thing. Just when it comes to, there's one point that I think it's really important. They want to frame China as being co-belligerent when it comes to Russia and Ukraine conflict. I think China would go to very, very large extent just not to be co-belligerent, not to sell weapons to Russia. First of all, Russia probably doesn't need it because it has a huge military-industrial complex. It doesn't need China. What China is providing here is ways to bypass sanctions, and they're committing to buy lots of Russian products so it can sustain Russian economy. But just think about it. China wants to promote this multipolar world, which is going to be non-interference, live and let live. So if you want to start that would be a very bad example just to support militarily Russia. So it would just go through such an extent. And we see the what is happening in Ukraine. We don't, you know, I mean, unless Europe gets suicidal, the collective West gets suicidal, they're not going to win. So China is pretty much safe. But again, you know, it's the collective West wants to frame China as co-belligerent. China will not. That's not the purpose. China, what is China doing right now? It's making peace. Yemen is going to be a brokered peace agreement by China because of China. They're putting Saudi Arabia, Iran around the table. That's what they want to show. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Once there's a multipolar world, you are going to see many wars ending, including the Palestinian issue. Everything is going to be solved. You know why? Just look at every single conflict you have around the world. You have always one side, and very often it's the minority, it's the smaller side, which is supported by the collective West. Why? Because it's the divide and control strategy. Once the collective West cannot play this role and cannot finance all those NGOs, NEDs, and so on, then you have countries that are not going to be so emboldened. They'll be like, you know what? Let's solve locally. So they are going to solve locally problems. Neighbors, you know, I can understand interference, not interference, but countries, neighbors being coming at the help. You know, and that's what we saw. We saw what happened in Kazakhstan. It was a beginning of a country like Russia saying, well, you know what, color revolution, those coups won't happen again, because it goes in contradiction with the UN Charter. You know, no interference. And China is going to be about this. You know, live and let live. And number one, every time, country sovereignty.
Yes.
You know, it's not about ideology. We go back over and over. Not about ideology. Ideology is wrong. It's wrong. If you respect the country's democracy, let them protect their sovereignty, and ultimately they'll find their own system.
Well, you brought up a lot of good points, but I just thought maybe China could use this as a workaround. Maybe they could just lend weapons to Russia, like South Korea is doing for the United States, because their legal system prohibits them from sending weapons to an active conflict. So they said, well, we're just going to lend some artillery shells, just 500,000 artillery shells to the United States, and then after a while, I guess they'll send them back or something. It's obviously, this is what the West is constantly doing. And I think Angelo made a very good point about how China doesn't want to simply replace the West and continue doing business like that. They're working on something much bigger. Angelo also talked about China needing to develop markets elsewhere, to diversify away from the US and Europe, who seem determined to destroy themselves. And isn't that the whole point? And maybe we could talk about this, Danny. The Belt and Road Initiative. People keep saying, this is debt trap diplomacy. They don't care about these countries. When you realize how important it is for them to expand markets elsewhere, you realize that this is almost a matter of self-preservation. To do a legitimate process of development in these nations, to develop their economies so that they can become larger, more efficient markets, so that they can help China. And obviously China is helping them. How do you see that? Do you see that as part of the motivation for the Belt and Road Initiative, Danny?
Oh, for sure. I mean, when I was in China and asked people about it, there was an incredible pragmatism to something like the Belt and Road Initiative. Indeed, China has principles and China has values, and many of them stand in complete distinction to the collective West. But a lot of the values that China adopts now, especially globally in how it conducts economic and political and diplomatic relations, really just reflect what the UN Charter says about how you do these things. And the Belt and Road Initiative is no different. But some of the pragmatism here is just that China's economy has grown incredibly fast. It is really huge. And there are sectors in China's economy that are bloated, that grew a little too fast and need relief through foreign investment. And that's what a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative is also all about. It's about opening up relief in gateways and pathways to the European market, to the global market, to make it more efficient, and also to clean up what some of the waste, I think, in what can happen with a foreign investment, including what happened with China. Is sometimes, you know, when you have laissez-faire economies, some folks like to go off and do their own thing and do their own business elsewhere, and with no benefit to the national interest. And China has done, especially in the era of Xi Jinping, a really immense job in tackling corruption. And the Belt and Road Initiative, because it is mainly state-directed, of course, with the help of the private sector, it is all about modeling the relationships that China would like to see all over the world, and that much of the world has embraced. I mean, it's more than 140 countries. It's more than a couple of thousand projects either completed or underway or in the planning process. And all of the countries that have partnered with China, for the most part, are underdeveloped countries, are poor countries, are countries that have long histories of understanding what it's like to follow the United States, follow the collective West down their path of economic relations, which is based on zero sum and based on the notion that one party should dominate and the other party should suffer the consequences of that domination. And China does it completely different. So the values that China holds, I was thinking about this too, is that a lot of the ways that China has conducted projects like the Belt and Road Initiative reflects this. As you were saying, Angelo, like ideology can be really poisonous. And during the Cold War, regardless of whatever we thought about which side had the correct values, the U.S. and the collective West was really able to weaponize ideology against socialism and communism and attempt to delegitimize whatever independence movements were arising all over the world. And I think the way China adapted through this like hide your strength and bide your time mentality that Deng Xiaoping initiated, it was to integrate China while also ensuring that China's sovereignty was protected and that it could adhere to its own values, but that there would never be any more impression from here forward that China was trying to export any kind of model. And that has become so attractive to the global South, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the global South has known is imposition and projection of ideology, economic system, political systems onto them from the outside, from the collective West. So I think China is just doing what's really smart here and assuming leadership de facto just by example, just by leading by example. And now countries like Saudi Arabia, something that maybe we wouldn't have even thought of 2 decades ago, Saudi Arabia deciding to diversify its own political and economic portfolio based upon just how influential China has become. And of course, Russia has to be included in that as well.